There is an unspoken rule that seems to govern nature. Whatever lives in the ocean will always be worse than whatever lives on land. This holds true today. And it held true for most of Earth's history too. Even during the age of dinosaurs, the things swimming beneath the waves would have given you more nightmares than a T-Rex ever could. In fact, if you scroll back through the story of this planet looking for a single moment where your odds were actually better in the water than on land, you'll come up nearly empty-handed. Nearly, because there was one narrow window, a very long time before the dinosaurs ever existed, when the sea was the safe option and everything above the surface, including the planet itself, seemed engineered for maximum suffering. This was the Lopengian. The name probably means nothing to you, and that's fair. It's obscure even by geologic standards. The Lopengian was the final epoch of the Permian period, running from roughly 259 to 252 million years ago, and it was a version of Earth you would not recognize in almost any respect. Even time itself worked differently. The moon sat in a tighter orbit back then, which meant the planet spun faster, and a full day lasted only about 22 hours. So on top of everything else you're about to hear, you'd have had less daylight to try and survive it in. Geography was just as unrecognizable. Nearly all of Earth's landmass had fused into a single supercontinent, Pangaea, dragging Africa, the Americas, Antarctica, India, Australia, and chunks of Europe into one enormous connected mass. Only to the east did you find any land free of Pangaea's grip, a sizable island made up of what is now Siberia, Kazakhstan, and North China, and further south, a second island combining South China with parts of Southeast Asia. Turkey, Iran, and Tibet were islands of their own too, boxed in by the Tethys Ocean on one side and the Paleotethys on the other. Together those seas were massive. And they were still nothing compared to what lay to the west. Panthalassa, a single superocean unlike anything before or since, swallowing more than 60% of the planet's surface, more than double the size of today's Pacific. Try to actually picture that. An ocean twice the size of the biggest ocean we have now. It sounds like exactly the kind of place you'd want to stay far away from. And yet, despite its staggering size, Panthalassa and its neighboring seas were surprisingly tame. Why, the water was the safe place. Sharks had already been around for 200 million years by this point. And if you know anything about Permian marine life, your mind probably jumps straight to Helicoprion, the 8-meter, 26-ton shark famous for its bizarre spiral of teeth curling out of its lower jaw like some kind of buzzsaw. It's the poster child for Permian ocean horror. But here's the catch. By the time the Lopengian rolled around, Helicoprion was already gone. It had died out earlier in the Permian, and its absence left the oceans strangely empty of anything genuinely massive. Its smaller relatives were still around, but smaller is doing a lot of work in that sentence. The largest of them, Cassiotis, topped out at about 2 meters, roughly the length of a leopard shark, and its teeth weren't even built for tearing through flesh. They were designed for soft-bodied prey like squid, not bone and muscle. Meanwhile, the other shark groups swimming around, the sphenacanthids and hybodonts, were diverse, but tiny, rarely growing past a single meter. The sea scorpions, eurypterids, the armored arthropods that once terrorized the Devonian seas at monstrous sizes, were faring even worse. By the Lopengian, they were down to just 2 known genera, none of them large, none of them apex predators, clinging on after never fully recovering from an extinction event tens of millions of years earlier. And that pattern held across almost every marine group. Trilobites, ammonoids, and cephalopods were still technically present, drifting through these waters, but in dwindling numbers and shrinking sizes. Part of the reason was a lesser-known catastrophe called the Capetanian mass extinction, which had struck just 2 million years before the Lopengian began. It doesn't get much attention today, but by some measures it was more lethal than either the extinction that killed the dinosaurs or the one that opened the door for them. Its damage was global, but the oceans absorbed the worst of it. So by the time you're standing knee-deep in a Lopengian sea, What you're looking at should honestly sound almost boring. Undersized sharks. A handful of struggling trilobites. No monsters lurking in the dark. But hold on to that feeling, because it's the whole point. On land, there were no such breaks. The Kingdom of Teeth, the Capitanian extinction, had devastated life on land too, but land bounced back faster. And what came out the other side was, if anything, more dangerous than before. The extinction had wiped out the decinodont group known as the Dinocephalians, the dominant large-bodied therapsids who had ruled the early and middle Permian. Their disappearance cracked the door wide open for something new to take over. And one group in particular walked through that door and never looked back. The Gorgonopsids. Paleontologists first uncovered their remains back in 1876, and one look was apparently enough to convince the researchers that ordinary animal names wouldn't cut it. They reached for Greek mythology's monstrous gorgons instead. Different Gorgonopsid species varied in size, but they generally shared a signature look, deep-set jaws, narrow elongated skulls, and long blade-like canines and incisors that made them among the very first saber-toothed predators to ever evolve. Superficially, they resembled saber-toothed cats like Smilodon. But they weren't cats. They weren't even mammals, they were therapsids, a lineage more closely related to mammals than to reptiles, but a full evolutionary step removed from either. Gorgonopsids had actually been around since the Middle Permian, first appearing about 265 million years ago as animals no bigger than a human foot, hunting small amphibians and reptiles because that's all they could manage. But as the Dinocephalians vanished and the late Permian wore on, Gorgonopsids kept getting bigger, generation after generation, until that trend produced the largest Gorgonopsid that ever lived, Inostrancevia. This wasn't just the biggest Gorgonopsid, it was the single largest land predator of the entire late Permian. Exceptional fossil remains suggest adults reached over 5 meters in length, and weighed north of 450 kilograms, roughly the mass of a large bear, though most individuals were closer in size to a tiger. What set Inostrancevia apart wasn't just bulk. Either it had unusually long, sturdy limbs that made it both durable and fast, letting it run down medium and large herbivores that would have easily outdistanced its slower relatives. And once it caught up to you, things got worse. Its upper canine stretched 15 centimeters long, among the largest teeth ever recorded in a non-mammalian therapsid, curved, serrated, and built to slice. A single bite could open catastrophic wounds and trigger massive blood loss. Paleontologists still debate exactly how it hunted. Some think it targeted the throat the way Smilodon is believed to have. Others think it favored a bite and retreat strategy, letting blood loss and shock finish the job over time. Either way, neither option ends well for you. Inostrancevia wasn't confined to one region either. Its range stretched across what is now Africa, Asia, and European Russia, and it turns up in wildly different environments: humid floodplains in South Africa, freezing deserts in Russia, anywhere it could find the occasional shallow lake or a thin stand of Glossopteris, the dominant plant life of the era. Its presence in those cold Russian deserts has even led some paleontologists to suspect it may have had fur, though that idea remains unconfirmed. One apex predator this size roaming 2 hemispheres would already be more than enough. But Inostrancevia had company. Dozens of other Gorgonopsid species prowled the late Permian. Many of them clustered in European Russia alongside its smaller forms like Proslavia, mid-sized hunters like Soroctonus, meaning herbivores in these regions, no matter how large, almost always had a Gorgonopsid sitting at the top of their local food chain. That alone made Permian Russia one of the last places on the planet you'd ever want to visit. Except it may have actually been worse in South Africa, where an entirely separate lineage of giant Gorgonopsids had evolved independently alongside Inostrancevia, the Rubigenes. While Inostrancevia held the record for the single largest individual, the Rubigenes were, on average, the largest Gorgonopsid family as a whole, distinguished by heavy, robust skulls and deeply serrated teeth that may have cut through flesh even more efficiently than Inostrancevia's. Species like Rubigia atrox, found across what's now South Africa and Tanzania, reached up to 3 meters long, with a skull making up more than 15% of its total body length thick-boned, and marked with bony bosses suggesting it was built to grapple with large, powerful prey. Oddly, despite all that raw skull mass, its bite force has been estimated at only around 715 newtons, barely 20% stronger than a wolf's, which only underlines how efficient those blade-like teeth really were. They didn't need brute force, just the right shape. And Rubidia was rarely hunting alone. Fossil evidence suggests it coexisted alongside at least 8 other genera within its own subfamily, ranging from medium to massive, and increasingly it looks like it shared its territory directly with Inostrancevia as well, meaning 2 of the largest terrestrial predators in Earth's history. Similarly sized and similarly built. We're likely competing for the exact same prey in the exact same region. That's about as close as the Permian gets to putting 2 apex heavyweights in the same ring. At this point, it should be clear, this was the planet of the Gorgonopsids. But just to really drive it home, they weren't even the only nightmare wandering the late Permian. Everything else that wanted you dead, the Theracephalians, were the other major predatory lineage stalking this world, and while they never reached Gorgonopsid proportions, they made up for it with sheer diversity, turning up across Russia, Antarctica, Africa, and China. A handful were herbivorous, but most were predators, and to an untrained eye you might mistake them for Gorgonopsids broad. Deep skulls, smaller straight teeth, more compact bodies. Some, like the dog-sized Eucambergia, may even have been venomous, which if confirmed would make them the first known venomous tetrapods in Earth's history. Others were semi-aquatic, some were fully terrestrial, and one striking form even evolved its own set of saber teeth independently. Of all of them, none was more successful than Mosquerinus, a jaguar-sized hunter with a disproportionately large lion-like head packed with sharp conical teeth, likely capable of a powerful bite. Fossil evidence suggests it pinned prey down with strong forelimbs before finishing the job with its jaws, and it appears to have been one of the most abundant predators of the entire late Permian, possibly displacing Gorgonopsids as the apex hunter in certain regions altogether. And then there was land's answer to a monster the water simply didn't have: Megawaitsia, a 9-foot, 3-meter-long relative of Mosquerinus that prowled European Russia and holds the record as the largest Theracephalian ever discovered. Fossilized droppings tied to this animal suggest it fed on large dicynodonts, and skull studies hint it may have carried venom glands with multiple delivery ducts capable of injecting lethal doses into prey. That claim isn't fully accepted, yet the condition of its prey's remains makes it hard to confirm, but if true, it means land had already produced a venomous apex predator before the reptiles or mammals ever got the chance. But even that's not the full picture. Slender, crocodile-like archosauromorphs armed with needle-thin teeth hunted across nearly every continent except Antarctica and North America. Their armored cousins, less fearsome individually but heavily plated along the back, possibly as a defense against therapsid attacks, ranged from monitor lizard-sized up to specimens the size of a female American alligator in European Russia. And then there were the amphibians, thriving in every freshwater system on Pangaea, evolved into ambush predators that made approaching any river, lake, or shoreline a genuine gamble. The largest of them, Prionosuchus, stretched 13 feet 4 meters of pure ambush predator lurking in South African waterways, sharing territory with Gorgonopsids and Theracephalians alike. European Russia had its own answer in the Archegosaurus lineage, slimmer but still reaching up to 3 meters long. Somehow, herbivores still managed to survive all of this. Across Pangaea, you'd find dicynodonts, captorhinids, and parareptiles carving out a living, and in many ways, they were more diverse than the predators hunting them. Lystrosaurus, a badger to pig-sized dicynodont, was among the most abundant animals on the planet. Using its powerful forelimbs and tusks to dig protective burrows, a survival strategy other unrelated groups, like the dicynodont-adjacent burrowers, independently evolved as well. On the opposite end of the spectrum, the pariasaurs became living tanks. Covered in bony scutes and dense armored plating, not unlike a clubtail-less ankylosaur. The largest and most famous, Scutosaurus, weighed over 1.2 tons, rivaling the biggest gorgonopsids in size, and relied entirely on its thick hide, spiked skull, and dense musculature to survive, since at that bulk, outrunning anything was never an option. If there was one small mercy to late Permian life, it's that you didn't have to look up very often. Unlike the Mesozoic skies that would eventually produce pterosaurs large enough to snatch a small dinosaur, the Permian sky held nothing that could seriously threaten a large animal. Giant dragonflies and their relatives might startle you, but they posed no danger beyond insects. The largest flyers of the era, the gliding Weygeltosaurids, grew no bigger than a large bat, spending most of their time in the trees rather than in open air. Getting one tangled in your hair would be unpleasant. It wouldn't be lethal. A planet actively trying to kill you if it feels like life was concentrated in just a few pockets, mainly European Russia and Africa. That's because it was. Vast stretches of Pangaea were close to uninhabitable. Average temperatures near the equator are estimated at around 35 C, nearly double what we experience today, fueling brutal aridity and turning huge swaths of the supercontinent into desert. To the north, the central Pangaean mountains stretched the entire horizontal length of the continent, choking off moisture and locking neighboring regions into relentless drought. And as harsh as that sounds, it was still the mild version of what the late Permian had in store. Because if you stuck around until roughly 252 million years ago, you would have watched the entire planet collapse into an apocalyptic wasteland. This was the end Permian extinction, the Great Dying, and the name is not an exaggeration, because it stands as the single worst extinction event in the planet's entire history. Most researchers trace its origin to the eruptions that formed the Siberian Traps, a volcanic region roughly the size of Western Europe, and the eruptions themselves are almost incomprehensible in scale. Lava flows over a kilometer thick, pouring across the landscape while spewing enormous volumes of carbon dioxide and sulfur into the atmosphere. Global temperatures spiked so severely that in some regions the year-round average matched the hottest month ever recorded in Death Valley. And even if you somehow had the heat tolerance to survive that, the air itself was turning against you, plummeting oxygen levels triggered widespread hypoxia, while some studies suggest the eruptions tore such a hole in the ozone layer that ultraviolet radiation in certain regions spiked by more than 5,000%. Scientists still debate exactly how long these effects lingered. What isn't in debate is the outcome. By the time it was over, 57% of all biological families and roughly 83% of all genera on Earth were gone. For comparison, the asteroid impact that ended the dinosaurs far more sudden, far more famous, wiped out closer to 17% of biological families. The Great Dying was in an entirely different category of devastation, and once again, the water came out ahead. Life in the oceans actually suffered even more than life on land during this event, hammered by rising temperatures and severe acidification. But here's the strange final twist. If you'd taken a swim during it, you wouldn't have been boiled alive. Sea temperatures during the extinction have been compared to a warm jacuzzi. Uncomfortable, maybe, but nowhere near as lethal as what was happening on the surface above you. Which brings the whole story back to where it started. For this one narrow slice of Earth's history, with saber-toothed therapsids stalking every continent, venomous predators possibly evolving for the first time, and a planet actively cooking itself from the inside out. The water, despite everything, was still the safer place to be. It wouldn't stay that way. Once the dust from the Siberian Traps finally settled and the atmosphere began to stabilize, the balance of power flipped right back to where it had always been. The oceans recovered first in the shallows, and it didn't take long for new marine predators to fill the empty niches the Great Dying had carved out. Within a few million years of the extinction's end, early marine reptiles were already testing the waters quite literally, and within tens of millions of years, the seas would be home to ichthyosaurs, pliosaurs, and eventually mosasaurs, animals that would make even Inostrancevia look like a reasonable creature to run into. The brief golden age of underwater safety turned out to be exactly that. Brief. A geological blink, sandwiched between one age of terror and the next. Land didn't stay empty for long either. The therapsids that had ruled the Permian were nearly wiped out completely, and in the vacuum they left behind, an entirely new group of reptiles began to diversify the archosaurs, distant ancestors of crocodilians, pterosaurs, and eventually the dinosaurs themselves. It would take millions of years for that lineage to climb to the top of the food chain, but when it finally did, it would produce predators that, in their own way, made Inostrancevia and the Gorgonopsids look almost quaint by comparison. So if you ever find yourself wishing you could time travel to witness prehistoric Earth firsthand, the Lopengen is worth remembering for a very specific reason. It's the one chapter in this planet's 4.5 billion year story where diving into the water was the smart move. Every other era, before it and after it, flips that logic on its head. The dinosaurs had their marine nightmares. The age of mammals has its own. Even today, whatever lives at the bottom of the ocean is very likely worse than whatever you'll run into on a hiking trail. But for a few million years, right before everything fell apart entirely, the ocean finally got to be the good option.